The Black Death. In the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague swept across the continent, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people, roughly one-third of Europe's population. The sheer scale of death and devastation permanently altered the course of European history. The disease originated in Central Asia and traveled along trade routes, carried by fleas on black rats aboard merchant ships. When it reached European ports, it spread with terrifying speed. Victims developed high fevers, painful swellings called buboes, and dark blotches on their skin caused by internal bleeding, hence the name Black Death. In many cases, death followed within days. Entire households and villages were wiped out in a matter of weeks. Fear and panic gripped society. With little understanding of disease transmission, many turned to superstition, blaming the alignment of planets, foul air, or even religious minorities, particularly Jewish communities, who were subjected to brutal pogroms and massacres. Physicians tried ineffective remedies, bloodletting, herbal concoctions, or aromatic herbs, but none could halt the plague. The consequences were profound. Fields lay untended, economies collapsed, and labor shortages transformed society. Peasants who survived found new bargaining power, as their work was suddenly in high demand. The rigid feudal system began to crack, giving rise to social mobility and unrest. The trauma also reshaped religion and culture. While some turned to deeper faith, others questioned the Church's authority after its inability to protect people from the catastrophe. The Black Death left behind more than death. It permanently reshaped Europe's demography, economy, and culture. In its wake, art and literature turned darker, medicine became more empirical, and society itself shifted toward the modern age. It remains one of history's most terrifying examples of how disease can topple entire civilizations. The 1918 Spanish flu. In the final year of the First World War, a new and terrifying killer emerged that would claim more lives than the battlefield itself. Known as the Spanish flu, the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 swept across the globe with unprecedented speed, infecting an estimated 500 million people, nearly one-third of the world's population, and killing between 50 and 100 million. It remains one of the deadliest medical disasters in recorded history. The pandemic's name is misleading. It did not originate in Spain. Rather, Spain was one of the few nations not under wartime censorship and freely reported on the outbreak. In contrast, other countries downplayed the disease to maintain morale. This secrecy only accelerated its spread, as soldiers and civilians alike were left unprepared. The Spanish flu struck with unusual ferocity. Unlike most influenza strains that primarily kill the very young and elderly, this virus disproportionately targeted healthy adults between 20 and 40 years old. Many victims suffered from a cytokine storm, where the body's immune system overreacted and destroyed its own tissues. Patients could go from healthy to dead in just a few days, with some collapsing on the streets. Cyanosis, a blue-black tint caused by oxygen deprivation, became a hallmark of the disease, adding to the horror. The global war helped fuel the pandemic's spread. Troop movements, crowded barracks, and hospital trains turned the flu into a global passenger. Cities like Philadelphia, which hosted massive public gatherings despite warnings, saw death rates skyrocket. Morgues overflowed, coffins ran out, and mass graves were dug, as entire communities were paralyzed. The impact was profound. Beyond the staggering loss of life, the Spanish flu reshaped public health. It accelerated the development of epidemiology, increased investment in disease surveillance, and highlighted the need for international cooperation in combating pandemics. Yet, despite its scale, it was quickly overshadowed in history by the First World War, leaving it as a half-remembered tragedy of the 20th century. The Spanish flu revealed the fragility of humanity in the face of unseen enemies. More than a war or disaster, it was a reminder that microscopic forces could change the course of history just as surely as armies and empires. The thalidomide tragedy. Late 1950s and early 1960s, a drug marketed as safe and revolutionary turned into one of the most devastating medical disasters of the modern era. The tragedy of thalidomide, a sedative and anti-nausea medication prescribed to pregnant women, resulted in the birth of thousands of children with severe deformities. Thalidomide was first introduced in West Germany in 1957 and quickly spread across Europe, Australia, Canada, and other countries. It was promoted as a wonder drug, particularly effective at alleviating morning sickness during pregnancy. Unlike earlier drugs, it was claimed to be safe, non-toxic, and impossible to overdose on. Doctors, trusting these assurances, prescribed it widely to expectant mothers. But beneath the promises lay catastrophe. Soon after its release, doctors began to notice an alarming spike in birth defects. Infants were born with phocomelia, severely shortened or absent limbs, as well as malformed organs, blindness, and deafness. Many died in infancy. At first, the connection to thalidomide was not recognized, but mounting evidence made the link undeniable. By the time it was withdrawn from most markets in 1961, it had caused an estimated 10,000 birth defects worldwide, though some experts suggest the true number may have been far higher. The scandal deepened because the disaster was preventable. Pharmaceutical companies had failed to conduct adequate safety testing, particularly on pregnant animals. Regulators in many countries approved the drug without rigorous review. In the United States, however, the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, refused to approve thalidomide, thanks largely to Dr. Frances Kelsey, who insisted on more safety data. Her caution spared countless American families from tragedy and turned her into a hero. The thalidomide disaster reshaped medicine forever. It led to sweeping reforms in drug testing and regulatory oversight, including mandatory testing on pregnant animals, stricter clinical trials, and stronger protections for patients. Yet the human cost remains a scar on medical history, a reminder of what happens when profit and haste eclipse responsibility. Survivors, many now adults living with lifelong disabilities, continue to advocate for awareness and justice. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. From 1932 until 1972, the United States Public Health Service conducted one of the most infamous medical studies in history, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. For 40 years, hundreds of African-American men in Macon County, Alabama, were deceived, mistreated, and denied medical care, a scandal that would forever stain the reputation of American medicine. The study began under the guise of examining the natural progression of untreated syphilis. 600 men were enrolled, about 400 with syphilis and 200 without, serving as a control group. The participants were mostly poor, black sharecroppers lured into the study with promises of free medical care, meals, and burial insurance. What they were never told was the truth. They had syphilis, and the government had no intention of treating them. Even after penicillin was discovered in the 1940s and became the standard life-saving treatment for syphilis, the men were deliberately left untreated. Doctors continued to observe the ravages of the disease, blindness, insanity, organ damage, and death, while withholding the cure. Families were devastated, wives infected, and children born with congenital syphilis. The deception lasted for decades, shrouded in official approval. It was not until 1972, when a whistleblower leaked information to the press, that the full scandal came to light. Public outrage was immediate. The experiment was shut down, congressional hearings followed, and a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the victims. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the U.S. government, acknowledging the deep betrayal and the pain inflicted on the survivors and their families. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment remains one of the worst breaches of medical ethics in history. It eroded trust in the medical establishment, particularly among African American communities, and sparked sweeping reforms in research ethics, including the requirement of informed consent and the establishment of institutional review boards, IRBs. It is a grim reminder of how racism, neglect, and disregard for human dignity can turn science into cruelty, and why vigilance in medical ethics remains essential today. The Plague of Justinian. In the year 541 CE, During the reign of Emperor Justinian I, the Byzantine Empire was struck by a pandemic that would later be known as the Plague of Justinian. It is considered the first recorded instance of bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same pathogen that centuries later unleashed the Black Death. The outbreak began in Egypt, then a vital grain supplier for Constantinople, and spread rapidly along Mediterranean trade routes. By the time it reached the Byzantine capital in 542, it had grown into a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. Contemporary accounts describe bodies piled in the streets as death overwhelmed the city. At the height of the outbreak, some sources claim as many as 10,000 people died each day in Constantinople alone, though the numbers are debated. The symptoms were gruesome. Victims developed fever, delirium, and painful swellings in the lymph nodes, similar to later bubonic plague outbreaks. Death often came swiftly, within days. Fear gripped the empire, with survivors believing the disaster was divine punishment. Religious processions filled the streets, but the dead were so numerous that mass graves and even abandoned buildings were repurposed to hold corpses. The social and economic effects were profound. Agriculture collapsed as fields were left untended, and trade ground to a halt. With so many dead, the empire faced severe labor shortages, inflation, and food scarcity. Justinian himself contracted the plague but survived, though his empire never fully recovered its former strength. The pandemic undermined his ambitious attempts to restore the glory of Rome by weakening the Byzantine state militarily and economically. Estimates suggest the plague of Justinian killed between 25 and 50 million people across the Mediterranean world, roughly half the population of Europe at the time. It marked the beginning of recurring plague waves that returned for 2 centuries. Though overshadowed in popular memory by the Black Death, the plague of Justinian was no less devastating. It reshaped the medieval world, weakened the Byzantine Empire, and stands as one of history's earliest and deadliest medical disasters. The smallpox epidemics in the Americas. When Europeans arrived in the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they brought with them not just ships, steel, and gunpowder, but also invisible killers. Chief among these was smallpox, a disease to which indigenous populations had no prior exposure or immunity. The result was one of the deadliest medical disasters in history, a pandemic that devastated entire civilizations. Smallpox was introduced to the Caribbean around 1514, likely carried by Spanish colonists or enslaved Africans. Within years, it spread to the mainland. When Hernán Cortés launched his conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1519, smallpox reached Tenochtitlan, where it tore through the population. Contemporary sources describe horrific scenes: bodies covered in pustules, fever, blindness, and death in staggering numbers. The epidemic killed Cuitláhuac, the Aztec emperor who succeeded Moctezuma, leaving the empire leaderless at a critical moment. Historians believe smallpox weakened Aztec resistance, paving the way for Spanish victory. The story repeated itself across the Americas. In the Andes, smallpox preceded Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire, wiping out tens of thousands, including Emperor Huayna Capac, and plunging the empire into civil war. In North America, successive waves of smallpox in the 17th and 18th centuries decimated native nations. Entire communities were reduced by more than half, and in some cases, cultures and traditions were lost forever. The scale of death is difficult to quantify, but estimates suggest that between 50 and 90% of indigenous populations perished from smallpox and other European diseases. This catastrophic decline is often referred to as the Great Dying, one of the greatest demographic collapses in human history. The smallpox epidemics did more than kill. They reshaped the Americas. They facilitated European conquest by destabilizing indigenous societies, cleared vast lands for colonization, and contributed to the rise of the transatlantic slave trade as European colonizers sought new labor sources. Smallpox's devastation echoes as one of history's most tragic examples of how disease, carried unknowingly, can change the fate of entire continents. The Bhopal gas tragedy. The city of Bhopal in central India became the site of the worst industrial accident in history. A catastrophe with devastating medical consequences that continue to linger decades later. At the Union Carbide India Limited pesticide plant, a storage tank containing methyl isocyanate, MIC, a highly toxic chemical, ruptured and released a massive cloud of poisonous gas over the sleeping city. Within hours, chaos descended. Thousands awoke coughing, blinded, and gasping for breath as the invisible cloud settled. Victims described searing eyes, burning throats, and lungs filling with fluid. Families fled in panic, but many collapsed in the streets before reaching safety. By dawn, more than 3,000 people were dead. In the following weeks and months, the toll rose sharply. Estimates suggest between 15,000 and 20,000 eventually died, with over 500,000 exposed to the toxic fumes. The immediate medical effects were horrific. Survivors suffered permanent damage to their lungs, eyes, and nervous systems. Children were orphaned, families shattered, and hospitals overwhelmed by waves of patients with no precedent for treatment. Even decades later, health issues persisted. Chronic respiratory illness, cancer, reproductive disorders, and birth defects in children born to exposed parents. The gas disaster was not just a one-night tragedy, but an ongoing public health crisis. The scandal deepened in its aftermath. Investigations revealed that the plant's safety systems had been neglected or disabled, and proper maintenance ignored to cut costs. Warning alarms failed to function, and local communities were left uninformed of the dangers. The negligence of Union Carbide, later acquired by Dow Chemical, became a symbol of corporate irresponsibility. Survivors and activists fought for justice for decades, with compensation often inadequate and cleanup of toxic contamination still incomplete. The Bhopal gas tragedy remains one of the darkest intersections of industry and medicine. More than an accident, it was a preventable disaster that exposed how corporate greed and regulatory failure can transform an industrial mishap into a generational health catastrophe. The mad cow disease crisis. In the 1990s, Europe was shaken by a public health crisis that began not in hospitals or laboratories, but in fields and slaughterhouses. Known as the mad cow disease crisis, it revealed the terrifying consequences of industrial farming practices and a failure to protect consumers from hidden dangers in their food supply. Mad cow disease, formerly called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, was a neurological disorder in cattle. It slowly destroyed the animals' brains, leaving them with bizarre symptoms like stumbling, aggression, and loss of coordination. The disease was caused by abnormal proteins, known as prions, which could spread through contaminated feed. Farmers had been feeding cattle protein supplements made from the remains of other cows, unknowingly creating a cycle of infection. For years, the risks were downplayed. But in 1996, scientists confirmed the unthinkable. BSE could jump species, infecting humans as variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, VCJD. This human form of the disease was fatal, with victims suffering severe brain damage, dementia, and eventually death. The revelation sent shockwaves through Europe and beyond. Governments scrambled to contain the crisis. Millions of cattle were slaughtered to stop the spread, while beef exports from the United Kingdom were banned. Supermarkets pulled products from shelves, and consumers grew terrified of eating beef. The sight of mass cattle culls and burning carcasses became one of the most haunting images of the decade. In the end, fewer than 300 human deaths were directly linked to VCJD, but the panic reshaped food safety laws worldwide. The crisis highlighted how cost-cutting in agriculture could have devastating consequences and underscored the importance of transparency in public health. The mad cow disease crisis remains a chilling reminder that even everyday foods can become deadly when science, industry, and safety collide. It showed that when shortcuts are taken in pursuit of profit, the fallout can shake not just an industry, but the trust of entire nations. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything, throw me a like and comment below on what you would like to see in the future. History never runs out of surprises, and neither do we. So subscribe and join me for the next dive into the archives.